Again, my name is Alva Hicks, and here to present a gem of an idea, if you will. I call it a global Eureka moment, and that it's something that I want to share with people throughout the world, but also scientists. And in itself, it stems from a Native American perspective on human origins that basically I consider a repatriation of an idea. A lot of times repatriation has to do with returning things that have been taken, but in itself, the idea that they have been here from time immemorial is something that scientists have yet to seriously rethink. It was thought of again in the 1860s through about 1912, when it was eventually set aside by William Henry Holmes. And as I go through these discussion points, I'll let you know that I will have images that will back up what I am portraying and putting forth in these ideas. Anyway, the idea again, this was set aside that we, as humanity speaking, spread to the old world, to quote William Henry Holmes, but he said that we didn't need to think that. And so from about 1912 through about 1990s, there was the question of the archaeology of the Americas. And but in itself, I think one needs to go to the paleontology of the issue, which was that the other naysayer that was prominent in the Americas was his name is Alfred R. He was the curator at the Smithsonian Magazine. He was a physical anthropologist, and he did nothing but found ways to even take skulls and the brains inside the skulls from cadavers that were abandoned sometimes, and expand upon the idea that everybody in the New World was recent, and or how do we decide, if there's a makeup of anybody that makes it more intelligent or more, and more whatever they think back then. Some of them didn't think as clearly as I think we should have been doing. But so Hirschlicka had an idea. He said, well, all of the specimens we're finding are Homo sapiens. So since we knew the old world has Homo sapiens at a recent time, that meant that the American Indians couldn't have great antiquity. They couldn't be as old as the Neanderthals, for instance, who are known to have dated back into evolutionary processes going back into Africa, 3 million years or more. So he immediately threw that out because we didn't have that non or human form of the skull and or the body. And so I liken that to a paradigm where you have to make the idea fit rather than being open to, well, what are the significance of that being we have been here from time immemorial and Homo sapiens. So in itself, he ruined the careers of many people. It's not my makings. I've been reported that if you found something and you were aspiring to find it to be of grand antiquity, it had to look like a Neanderthal. And so the same premise that is used for that was used in archaeology. The New World, definitively the site in Monteverdi, buried in peat, broke the barrier of 13,200 when Clovis points were found. All over both, mostly North America and fishtail points in South America. But these are points that are really easily discerned as napped and shaped and formed to make a projectile point. And they became very dominant in the archaeological record. And when they were first discovered in 1907 by George McJunkin, who was the foreman of the Crowfoot Ranch. He was a descendant of slaves. He actually lived as old enough to be a slave. He was young at that time. But he found these sites that were had stones in them, showing that the animals that were hunted were Pleistocene of age. They were giants of the world at the time. They didn't look like a buffalo today. They're a giant bison, and they dated and went extinct at a certain time. So after that discovery, and they ultimately went and brought this material to the museum when they 20 years later, after about 1996 or 7, the archaeologists there came down to New Mexico and to Clovis and said, wow, we have something here. This shows that people were here 10,000 years ago. So Arliss Scharschlicke still denied it to his death. He denied that, well, maybe these animals lived longer than we thought, then they didn't go extinct earlier on. And he had a lot of excuses, but he made it very difficult. But again, returning to the archaeological prospect, those Clovis points had been showing up all over. But George McJunkin was the one who made it important enough to deal with. And so later on, the owners of the Crowfoot Ranch were able to bring archaeologists from the Denver Museum to validate this. Now, at that point became the new paradigm for how long people have been in the Americas. They've been in the Americas at the turn of the Ice Age, when it last started melting. Now, the reason that that's significant is that we have sites now that are pre-Clovis. They date before these tools. And most archaeologists have now accepted that there is a pre-Clovis stage. And in itself, the same argument that Arliss Scharschlicke was making, that we need to have a Neanderthal-looking guy to have age, we were saying that the New World needed to mirror the archaeological record of Neanderthals and Homo erectus in the Old World, which is called the Middle Paleolithic. It's a set of tools that are designed as usually handheld hand axes used to break open bones or dig in the ground or secure food, not always, wood and perishable materials, I'm sure made up a part of all of our, whether they were Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. But the New World doesn't have the Middle Paleolithic, nor does it have Homo erectus. So there's a common duality there. One's archaeological, one's physical, anthropological. They both have set back the open-mindedness that is required to understand the significance of pre-Clovis. So I say that the general form here is to go forward as human beings have been here from time immemorial. And a recent paper that was just written, and I just got a hold of through my Google search. I follow what other people read, and I often send it back to some of the people who I research with, who are scientists. I take these papers, and the one was so significant. It recently came up, I said 2 weeks ago, this is August. It showed that Neanderthals stole fire from the natural environment when they did use fire. Even in the coldest times of Northern Europe, when there weren't as many fires to grab, there was very little evidence that they made fire, that they procured fire from the natural environment. Well, we have sites in the Americas that predate Clovis by far. One site is in New Mexico at the same area, the same Air Force Base in White Sands, that they found the footprints of Homo sapiens walking around with giant ground sloths and mammoths, and it's well accepted. It's been around for now about 3 years. It's only 23,000 years old, but it gets to a point where the definition of these hearths in the adjacent cave found on the same army base, there's numerous hearths rock-lined hearths that have been burned. And so they can't be geofacts because Neanderthals never built hearths. So the fact that they were built in the Americas at an earlier time, and we have almost every archaeological site has these hearths somewhere laid in them, whether it's Monteverde 1, dated at 33,000, there's several hearths, or even Goodyear's Topper site, which we've recently been discussing. He has a hearth too. He's never really promoted it too much. But the point is, these hearths are something that diagnose human activity, just like footprints. And this site in New Mexico was so well preserved, so well excavated by Richard Scotty McNeish, that he was able to see that the clay that they embedded into the soil had fingerprints and palm prints. And in those palm prints, they took the evidence to Toronto, the police department there, and they were able to scan and look at these footprints and see that there were sweat dots in between the lines. Only human beings do that. It's not a possum tail, can't be dismissed for some other reason. But they lined these hearths in that way. And another remarkable thing about that one site, they found a horse hoof. And embedded in the horse hoof was a fox bone. So they went and they x-rayed it. And then they looked at the tip of that fox bone, and they could see that it had been worn and shaped by putting it into a fire and shaping it into a point. And what they were using the point for in a horse hoof, I don't know, but they were using it to pry things. And that site also contains bowling ball size sacks of small round tools, which are now found throughout the Americas in pre-Clovis and Clovis times, of bolo stones. Bolo stones. Now, projectile point hunting is one thing, but using a stone with a net tied to it and using it to trap a rabbit or a small animal or even, maybe a gazelle, that is a technology, but it's not projectile point. So things are going on in the Americas that are hard to understand, but they don't have to mirror what we find in the old world. And I try to make that point in this beginning here. So what we're looking at is why we set the New World aside and how difficult it has been since we first discovered Clovis to get past that parameter. And though it's very important that we understand their science has parameters. It has thresholds of knowledge. And we continue to hand the baton off, and the next person gets it, and they do something with it. Eventually books are written because you can't just do orally. So then the typist becomes an important person, or a printing press. So, I liken it to what happened to Copernicus in 1512. He was able to use a telescope. He was able to discuss this with people, but they didn't have a printing press. It wasn't available to the layperson all over. People did write, and they did communicate, but it wasn't really like a book. By the time Galileo came around in the 1560s, when he published and wrote his work, they were making books. And the church took offense to letting an idea like the Earth is not the center of the cosmos, more or less even the center of the solar system. So we think that we are in control, but sometimes we have to control what we think. And the methods for how we decipher how things came to be. And so, discovery is essence of passing a new baton, a new way of looking at things, a new way of doing things. It's called the Age of Reason in Europe, but people were reasoning throughout the world, whether Mesoamerica or Asia, Australia. People were measuring truth, and they had a lot of important values that they lived with those truths, including how to live and survive. So, in itself, I'm trying to bring this idea back to a survival point where we can begin to appreciate all the work that's been done before us. Now, in my efforts to get this idea put out, I've I've come across many Eureka moments, I call them. You know, there are points where, gee, I was hoping to find something that might support what I'm thinking. I didn't really have to make it up. I mean, there was people like Ameghino and Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, and making ideas that humans started here. So, you know, I started looking at trying to disprove my idea, so I went to find in 1984, well, it was the year the book was published, but basically when I started this idea, this study, well, written by Smith Spencer, and they were the editors, and the other people in this World Survey of the Fossil Evidence, they used specific people who were experts in Asia or Europe or Africa or the New World, and so we tried to build on that, and so that was one of my first Eureka moments. They pointed out that despite the fact that we're looking at Homo erectus as the only alternative, the rather desperate, we use the word, means by which they were articulating the data would become apparent to the reader of this volume. And it became apparent to me. There's a lot of problems in looking at it without a solution. So I wasn't trying to prove them right. I was trying to get the information that would shed light on the alternative, which they highlighted in the preamble, the preface. That was one of the places where it was first articulated to me that the New World archaeologists and naturalists were arguing for the relative stability of the human form over time. And notice I didn't say modern human form. It's the human form over time. And so that's a quote from that, you know, like page XX1 of the preface. So Spencer made that argument. Spencer died at the age of 51 shortly after. He was an advocate, you know, and so was Sir Arthur Keith and other people of this idea. He wasn't likely to just let it go by. So he did articulate it. To me, that was one of my first Eureka moments. Wow, we really don't know for sure. So perhaps the next one, and I can not go so long into it, is the finds in the Yukon where they found bone tools that predate stone tools at a time of 45,000 years ago, before we really got to the old world. A recent paper that was just up showed that a cave in Siberia is 45,000 years old. That predates the arrival of man in Europe by about 2,000 years. Why are people in Siberia? What's the significance? Why doesn't the Yukon maybe have a place for why bone tools were so dominant in the archaeological record at that early time? And that helps us understand what we're expecting to find in the New World and why we should be starting to redig deeper into the sediments that we have in the New World. I mean, there's a lot of work still to be done. So anyway, another point that I can keep going on, and I think I'll just hit on a couple more. This is called the Mousterian problem. And Neanderthals performed in a Middle Paleolithic way. They made these stone tools. They didn't really procure fire, but they made lots of stone tools. Well, and anatomically, they were relatively the same species up until their demise, their extinction, at 43,000 to 32,000 when they finally went extinct. And chimpanzees still live and apes still live, but that doesn't mean that higher primates didn't form them and or even Homo erectus. The fossil record actually for the gorilla goes almost 2 million years. I mean, it's been living in the trees as a gorilla for almost 20 million years. Excuse me, 20 million years. And the genetic background of that species, even though they live in different areas of Africa, some are mountain gorillas, some are lowland gorillas. Their genetic makeup is retained in such a way that it shows antiquity that's almost greater than the human antiquity. And why is that? Why could that be? Was we're only looking at a subset of the original founding populations that arrived in the Old World from the Americas. The whole bottle contains all the genetic diversity of the people who left initially. And I'll explain this, as was explained by Johnson et al. Out of Stanford, with Luca Cavalli Sforza and Douglas Wallace. So the geneticists have found a lot of things that are significant. And I'm going to point out that the genetic data is just as good as the archaeological data if you interpret it properly. And I did dig through the libraries at, especially the Davidson Library at UCSB, on virtually a religious basis. I mean, I was there, at least once a month to get to the library. I was there a lot more than that, traveling from my remote homestead. And take these books home and articles. I make copies, again, at 7 cents a page, pilfering them, taking them home, highlighting them, having a typist put them into set. Those are available on my website. They're very valuable. And they were from 1994, 1995, through the turn of the millennium, to 2000, when I no longer went to the libraries like that. Today, I use current periodical search through following what other people read. And when I read, have a list of archaeologists and geneticists and linguists and other type of people that read papers, paleontologists. There are different types of papers that they read, but I can try to make sense of the significance of some of these papers. And like I said, there's one that's right now showing blade tools in Siberia for the first time. Just came out 2 weeks ago. These papers have been going on though, but this is a cave site. They were able to excavate a cave site that is near the Gobi Desert, where it is articulated the levels to provide us with the first modern human tools, which are blades. They weren't necessarily making projectile points at that time. Why did they make these blades? Because they encountered Homo erectus. They were making lots of tools, but they weren't making blades. Blades are a highly refined, very thin, very Homo sapien type of tool. And they were designed, and that's why it is considered the initial Paleolithic, upper Paleolithic of the Old World. The upper being modern context. So initial doesn't mean that it's early, it means it's before early. It's the initial. And that's what they're finding in Siberia. Why? Because the roots are back in the Yukon. Why? Because it's so hard to leave the Americas. Why? How can we know that? Because the horse never made it to the Old World before the Ice Ages. It was surrounded by water. And many animals, bovines, didn't make it to the New World. The bison, and elephants, they didn't make it to the New World until the land bridge formed. And it formed for the first time 2.5 million years ago. But the zebra, the Prozwowski horse, the original breeds of horses of Europe, all come from an evolutionary process in the Americas. And we know that. We can go back tens of millions of years and look at Equus and how it became differentiated, but mostly it was the same, it just got bigger. So, consistent with the fossil paleontological record, Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, the divergence between the two species is not found in paleontology. The authors of the real science of paleontology and human origins have a real problem, a discrepancy, if you will, of being able to accept that that really happened, that we actually evolved suddenly from another species, because it doesn't happen to animals, and it didn't happen to us if we look at the Americas, where we may have been modern for many, many tens and hundreds and millions of years, as early prognosis stated, or were anticipated, since they didn't have any conjecture. It was a matter of just providing some new evidence, since we had developed the idea of evolution in 1959 with Darwin's publication of The Origins of Species. So, along those lines, I can go on. I have a lot of topics. I have a letter from Cavalli Sforza. He says that the Americas is more like a battlefield than a research topic. And one of the leading authors of this American scene, his name is David Meltzer. He wrote me a letter, but he wrote a book also titled The Paleolithic War. Well, if this is how science works, then maybe we need to understand there's a reason why we don't have peaks, why we don't have objectivity, why we don't have appreciation for why we have a battlefield when it comes to how old people were in the Americas. We need to redefine the paradigm that says you can't have them here very long. You know, like native people believe they've been here from time immemorial. We've dismissed that. They don't. Many of them, they understand what I'm talking about, Homo sapiens in the old world too. But scientists, that's their whole reputation. They've built it on something that may be, it's been set aside, the idea that it was alternative to it long ago. And alone have the people of the Americas been any consideration. You know, out of Asia, out of Europe. Well, you know, Boas, not 1990s, one of the first anthropologists to pick up the issue, had an expedition out of Columbia University, and it was called the Jessup Expedition. Jessup was a financier of this expedition, and they went to try to prove that the ancestors of the Indian lived in Siberia. And what they were able to determine, after examining both the biological aspects and linguistic aspects, and folklore and behavior, and a lot of other elements of their scientific work, which was a team of people both in Russia and from Columbia University in the Americas. They were able to decipher that the reason that some of these Paleolithic people in Siberia look like Indians is that they came from the Americas recently. At the onset of when the last ice age melted, they moved back into Siberia. Well, there was an earlier migration into Siberia I just described, the one that begins with the Upper Paleolithic in Siberia and the Yukon. So why can't we figure out migrations? I mean, the Indians, supposedly Native Americans, found the Americas. Well, I would make them prime examples of somebody who would be able to follow back into Northeast Asia if they came from there. But they had the technology to do that. They had the Clovis points. They were hunting animals up into the corridor into Alaska, which is the melting between the Laurentide and the Coralline ice sheets. That corridor shows that the Clovis points are older in New Mexico and Colorado, if you will, today, all the way moving up into Alaska, where they pretty much are younger.